Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're opening up a case file on one of history's most pivotal economic moments, the state of the Indian economy in 1947. After 200 years of British rule, what did India actually inherit? Let's dig in.
And really, this quote from a British viceroy says it all. India wasn't just some other colony. It was the absolute jewel in the crown, the centerpiece of the entire British Empire.
So that leads us to the big question we're tackling today. When that sun finally did set on the British Empire in India, what was left? What did the economic reality look like for the brand new nation?
To really get what was happening in 1947, you've got to rewind and look at the blueprint for the last 200 years. The fundamental goal of British economic policy? Well, it was never about developing India. It was all about extraction for Britain. And here is that strategy in a nutshell. It was a brutally simple two-step process, a closed loop, really, designed to power Britain's own industrial revolution. Step 1, turn India into a giant supplier of cheap raw materials, things like cotton and jute. Step 2, turn right around and force India to be a captive market, buying back those very same materials as finished goods from British factories.
So let's look at the evidence, starting with the absolute backbone of the Indian economy, agriculture. And we're not talking about a small slice of the pie here. This was the livelihood for a whopping 85% of the population.
Now, to understand just how far things fell, you need to see where they started. I mean, listen to this description from a 17th century French traveler talking about Bengal. It was seen as an agricultural powerhouse, famous for being incredibly prosperous.
But by 1947, that picture was ancient history. The whole sector was just stuck, completely stagnant. You had exploitative land systems, like this thing called the zamindari system. It basically meant profits went to landlords, who, by the way, had zero reason to invest in the land, instead of the farmers actually doing the work. You combine that with no new investment and a forced switch to cash crops for British factories, and yeah, it was a recipe for rock-bottom productivity and widespread hardship.
And this wasn't just happening in the fields. See, India was once a world leader in manufacturing, especially when it came to textiles.
I mean, you had products like Dhakai muslin. This stuff was legendary around the world. The best of the best was so fine, so high quality, it was literally considered fit for kings and queens. This was a massive symbol of India's industrial skill.
So, what happened? Well, the colonial policy was basically de-industrialization by design. And this slide just lays it out perfectly. The goal was super simple. 1, you crush India's world-famous handicraft industries, so there's no competition. And 2, you flood that now empty market with your own cheap, machine-made stuff from Britain. The end result? Total collapse of these traditional industries and, you guessed it, huge unemployment.
Okay, so you might be thinking, what about new industries? And yeah, a few modern factories did pop up in the 20th century, but their growth was just painfully slow. It was like trying to fix a giant hole in a dam with a tiny piece of chewing gum. And the really critical part, there was almost no capital goods industry. That's the industry that makes the machines for other industries. Without it, India was completely dependent on Britain for the very tools it needed to build itself up.
And this whole pattern of extraction, it played out big time in foreign trade, which was totally re-engineered to benefit, well, you know who.
So, Britain methodically took monopoly control over India's trade. And then, in 1869, the Suez Canal opened. This was an absolute game changer. Suddenly, it was way faster and cheaper to ship raw materials out and finished goods in. Fast forward to the 1900s, and more than half of all of India's foreign trade was just with Britain.
And this all leads to probably the most important idea to understand here, the drain of wealth. Here's the crazy part. India was actually making a profit on the world stage. It was exporting more than it was importing. But that money, that wealth, it never came back to India. Nope. It was siphoned off to pay for the entire colonial machine. Everything from the paychecks of British bureaucrats in London to the cost of Britain's wars.
Okay, but hold on. What about the railways? You hear this all the time, right? That Britain left behind this amazing infrastructure. So let's really dig into that. What was the real reason they were built?
Look, were there some social benefits? Sure, people could travel long distances, which was new, but that was more of a side effect. The primary reason for the railways was pure colonial strategy. They were built to move troops quickly, and even more importantly, to get raw materials from deep inside the country out to the ports so they could be shipped to Britain. The bottom line from the sources is pretty clear.
any social good was just an accident, and it was completely overshadowed by the massive economic gain for Britain. So, when you add all this up, what was the human cost? What did these policies actually do to the people of India? Well, the numbers, they paint a pretty grim picture.
With hardly any public health to speak of and disease running rampant, life expectancy at birth was just 32 years. Let that sink in.
Overall literacy, less than 16%. And for women, it was even worse, a staggering low of just 7%.
The infant mortality rate, this one is just shocking. 218 deaths for every 1,000 births. I mean, that's a number that just screams deep, widespread poverty and a total lack of basic health care.
And if you look at where people worked, you see an economy that was basically stuck in the past. Nearly 3/4 of the entire workforce was still trapped in that same stagnant agricultural sector we talked about at the beginning.
So let's wrap this up. The final verdict? It's pretty clear. By the time 1947 rolled around, 2 centuries of colonial rule had left India's economy just crippled. The challenges ahead were monumental.
So this was the inheritance. You've got an agricultural sector with rock-bottom productivity, an industrial sector that was hollowed out and desperate for investment, a trade system that was built to serve Britain, not India, an infrastructure designed for extraction, not for the public good. On top of all that, rampant poverty and unemployment. So yeah, the challenges were just enormous, which brings us to that final question on the screen. When an economy has been systematically taken apart for 200 years, where on earth does a new nation even begin? That was the unbelievable task facing the leaders of independent India. And that, right there, is the key takeaway from this entire story.